El doctor Ingesson, tot i que ser bastant més jove que el coronel Lee, també té un currículum important. Ell és especialista en presa de decisions militars, també ha tractat el camp de la intel·ligència, també de la contraintel·ligència i l'espionatge industrial, així com les relacions i cultures organitzatives de diferents països. Avui ens parlarà de l'experiència sueca i concretament del Nordpat II, que va ser el batalló sueco-danès que va tenir un paper tan destacat durant la guerra de Bòsnia. N'hem parlat moltes vegades, hem compartit molts articles, però en tot cas avui ell ens en parlarà i a més també estem contents perquè ens ha portat la seva tesi, Politics of Combat, una anàlisi sobre la presa de decisions militars i l'impacte del que és a nivell tàctic, a nivell estratègic. And now it's the turn of Dr. Ingesson. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here to this beautiful city. Although it's probably a good thing that I can only stay for a few days because the food is too good here. Otherwise, there would be consequences for me, I think. So I'm going to talk about a unit called Nordbat II, and specifically from the perspective of mission command in Bosnia in 1993 to 1995. So to give you a bit of background, here is Bosnia in 1993 to 1995, circa. You have the following main factions. As you know, there was what we would call in the business, what we call an intrastate conflict, which is civil war in more regular terminology. So you had VRS, which is the Bosnian Serb army, the HVO, which is the Bosnian Croat military forces, and the ABI, which is the Bosniak, so the Bosnian Muslim forces. In addition to these, you also had a lot of paramilitary units, which were, to some extent, they could have been affiliated with either the VRS, the HVO, or AB, or they could be more or less independent, or sometimes they would fluctuate in between. So sometimes these paramilitary units would pursue crime for their own personal gain. Sometimes they would pursue genocide for their own amusement or for some political objective. And sometimes they would focus on securing smuggling routes because that was very profitable at the time. So the paramilitary units were a difficult particular category, and it's important to keep them in mind. And the Swedish unit also had several of these encounters with these quite well-armed, dangerous, and fairly unpredictable units. But the VRS, HVO, and ABH were also fairly dangerous from time to time. So on this map, you can see the Swedish-Danish unit here in the upper right corner of Bosnia, based in Tuzla, in the area around Tuzla. And further down, you have the Dutch BAT, as it was called, unit in Srebrenica with the adjacent towns. So the mission here was somewhat simplified, to keep it short, to provide humanitarian assistance. This was the mission as interpreted by Sweden, to monitor military activity, because it was supposed to be a peacekeeping mission. So we were supposed to ensure that the parties to the conflict respected the peace, which, as we will see, was not actually the case. To monitor the safe areas, and this was set up by the UN Security Council, that there were supposed to be safe areas where civilians should be able to get to, and once they were in the safe areas, the UN forces were supposed to protect them. Hence, safe areas. So Tuzla was one safe area, Srebrenica was another safe area. Also, one of the Swedish tasks was to clear snow from the main roads. So another Swedish specialty, although less dramatic. So what this actually ended up being, as interpreted, once the Swedes and the Danes and some Norwegians arrived, they quickly realized that all of this became less important than this, to protect civilians, because as they found out, the war was not actually in a state of pause. It was the war was going on. It was fluent. It was sometimes more violent, sometimes a little bit less violent, but it was a constant level of violence and genocide all the time. So the first Swedish battalion commander quickly identified the main mission objective as being protect civilians, which is linked to the whole safe areas, because it is pointless to try to provide humanitarian assistance if the civilians are getting killed while you're trying to do it. So that was his interpretation. So if we look at the results, what did Nordbat II achieve during this period, 1993 to 1995, especially during the first few months, which I think are crucial. So here's one example involving a number of refugees. In this case, we have a Swedish detachment, a small Swedish unit on patrol, and they have heard rumors of a massacre in a village called Stupnido. So they are on their way to investigate, and they find 25 refugees who have escaped Stupnido and are hiding in the woods. So they start to talk to these refugees, and then a minivan shows up carrying, in this case, Croat troops. And the Swedes have an armored personnel carrier. So when they see the Croats approaching, they immediately take action to prepare to fire their heavy machine gun and start aiming at the car that is approaching. This scares the Croats, so they drive into the ditch. So that averts that situation, and the Swedes can load the refugees into the Swedish vehicles. And it should also be added, while they're doing this, they are overcrowding the Swedish vehicles. They're not supposed to carry this many people. So the end result is that the gunner who is manning this machine gun has to basically climb up and expose his body outside of armor protection just to make sure that they can fit all the civilians inside. So he's taking a risk in doing so, and he knows he's taking a risk, but he does it anyway. Then the Swedes, they drop off these refugees at a safe location, but when they are trying to get back to where they originally started from, they're of course stopped at a Croatian checkpoint, because the Croats by now have heard the news of what the Swedes are doing. So they decide to stop them at a checkpoint. The Swedish battalion commander hears about this. He orders the detachment to wait for exactly 2 minutes. And if the Croats keep stopping you, you just drive straight through the checkpoint, because you have armored cars, and whatever they put in between is not going to be able to stop you. So just drive through it. And then, so this works. They're able to get through this checkpoint without driving through it, because the Croats understand the threat that they are presenting. So the detachment is stopped again in a place called Vrs, and this time the Croats have ensured that they have anti-tank units, that they have people carrying RPGs, and these RPGs are sufficient to take out these armored cars, because they've realized that the Swedes are using the armored cars to force their way. So the gunner in this vehicle, he realizes that, okay, maybe they'll try to shoot me first because I'm manning the gun. Then he instructs the guy next to him in the car, if they kill me, you have to shove me out of the way and man the gun. But at this very tense situation, the Swedish battalion commander personally drives up, and then he just forces the Croats to back through what I would call force of personality. He is simply so aggressive and persuasive in his way of addressing them that they start to back off. And it may sound a bit difficult to visualize, but it's hard to describe this man simply. He was very strong leadership abilities, if you put it like that. So in this case, we see that the Swedes, this is October of 93, this is very early after their arrival in country, and they start out like this. They immediately show a willingness to take risks and to force the issue and not let themselves be held back by the parties to the conflict. So continuing on the thread of Stupnido, because there's still rumors of the massacre, right? So the Swedish battalion commander orders 2 platoons to investigate Stupnido. So there are checkpoints around Stupnido because, of course, considering what's going on inside, they don't want UN troops to be able to enter and document and see what's going on. So they have checkpoints to stop them, and they have anti-tank mines, and they have fairly sizable armed presence. So the Swedes, at this point, they threaten to simply launch an attack against these people who are trying to stop them, and to use their, in this case, they had tracked vehicles. They had armored personnel carriers with tracks, like tank tracks, so they can drive through using the terrain. So they say that if you don't let us through, we will attack and we will bypass and we'll go through, and we will get in one way or the other. And in the end, it's not a real attack, but they force their way through and they get shot at, but they still proceed. So they get into Stupnidå, and once they're inside, they're able to investigate the massacre that had in fact occurred. They document a lot of what's going on, take photos, and they are able to act as witnesses. And the evidence they collect is later used in post-war trials to convict some of the war criminals who were involved in this. Again, it's very important to remember this is very shortly after they arrive in country that all of this takes place. We have another case, same year, but a few months later, in December, late December of '93. We have a Swedish platoon, so a small unit, 25, in this case, just over 25 men. They're supposed to relieve a Canadian company, and as you know, a company is a much larger unit, about 5 times maybe that size in this case. So you have a Canadian company, and they have been guarding a hospital in a remote area. Swedish platoon moves in to take over the responsibility for guarding this hospital. And as soon as the Canadians have left, a Croatian battalion, which is larger still, so here we're talking about maybe 300-400 troops, and the Swedes are 25 to 30, so 10 times their number, and Croats show up. And a battalion also has a lot more firepower than a single platoon has. They immediately place mines on this single road that lead, very small, difficult road that leads up to the hospital to ensure that no reinforcements can arrive to help the Swedes. And then they issue an ultimatum. They say, we need you to hand over the Muslim nurses inside the hospital, handful of people. The Swedish platoon says, there's no way we're going to do that. And they show clearly to the Croats that they're preparing for combat. So they're bringing out weapons, they're putting hand grenades on their belts, loading up everything, getting ready, taking positions to defend the compound. And the Croats try to see if they're bluffing, basically. So to fire mortar rounds from launchers, but the Swedes stay in position. During this process, they also blow up a couple of antennas, as I recall, but Swedes wait until it's somewhat calmer, then they go out and repair the antennas. So the Croats notice that, okay, we're not going anywhere with this. They're not moving. So the Croats try to change the ultimatum. They say, okay, we're not going to demand the nurses. We just want access to the hospital. We just want to see what's going on. This is a very typical thing for this conflict, that they would try to maneuver this way. They would request access, which sounds more reasonable, but they know that they are many times more in numbers than the Swedes are. So if they get access, it will be very difficult to stop them. But then they will be able to do whatever they want. Swedes realize this, say, no, you can't have access. And then they have a standoff that lasts throughout the entire night. So the Swedes are on full combat alert throughout the entire night. And this is very interesting because I've read a lot of the testimonies that were collected in the fairly shortly after this, in a few years after this happened in the 90s. And if you look at these testimonies, you can see clearly that the Swedes understood that if the Croats decide to actually attack, none of us are going to survive. If we keep fighting them, they'll kill us all easily. But we have to, because this is the mission, this is what we came for, and we can't. If we back down now, this is verbally from verbatim from one of the officers who were on the location. He said, "If we back down now, where does that leave us? We can't back down. We have no choice. We have to defend this, even if it's the last thing we do, because it's the right thing to do." So they stuck out, waited in their combat positions, and in the morning, the Croats realized that they're not bluffing. They're going to stay. So, and then of course, time had lapsed, and the Croats knew that we can't keep pressure up forever, because sooner or later someone is going to get here and reinforce the Swedes anyway. So the Croats simply left. And again, I think it's a very important case of showing that if you show this kind of level of determination, show that you're not willing to be manipulated and played, that you're willing to accept the risks that come with it, it becomes much more difficult for these fairly cunning players in this conflict to get what they want. Because they are not looking to attack, really, because they understand that if they attack and kill Swedish peacekeepers, things are going to probably get very difficult for them. So they were used to threats and manipulation. And when that doesn't work, in this case, they just run out of tools, and then they have to leave. Here's another famous example from April the year after, so April 94. But by this time, it's rather tense between all the parties to the conflict and Nordbat II, because they have been constantly being quite tough on the parties to the conflict. On numerous occasions, they've opened fire. When someone takes a shot at them, they simply shoot back a lot more. And the parties to the conflict, in this case the VRS, they wanted to teach them a lesson, in a sense. So they had a Danish tank unit as part of Nordbat II. It's a tank company. And it was ambushed by Bosnian Serb anti-tank units. And this time it wasn't just guys with RPGs. They had anti-tank guns that they had carefully hidden along a hillside, and they had anti-tank missiles, and they had prepared for this engagement. And they had tricked the Danes into approaching along a route that they had expected them to drive along. So the Danes start to take fire, and the Danish unit commander, he orders the tanks to return fire, but not just to shoot and cover a retreat. He says, destroy all the anti-tank positions. That's your orders. And the tanks start shooting, and they expend 72 of their main gun rounds from their big tank guns. So they destroy these anti-tank guns and missile crews. And in the process, they also accidentally hit a Bosnian Serb ammunition depot, which was behind a hill. And one of the tank rounds went high over the hill, down into the valley, hit the ammunition depot, and blew it up in a huge explosion. So this also caused quite a stir, because this is not normal procedure at the time. And they tried to confront the Danish commander, and they said, why did you fire 72 main gun rounds? And he said, I didn't have any more. I ran out. And that's fairly typical. I should also explain that the Danish commander of this tank unit was also a very forceful character. A guy with a mustache who smoked a pipe. And at one point, when they shot at him, one of the shrapnels gave him a very shallow cut on his throat. But of course, that could easily have killed him if it had just a few more millimeters, it would cut his throat. But so he got a small cut on his throat. And when he was asked about it, he said, I got a long distance shave. So that's kind of attitude he had. So, but it's also important to note here that Nordbat II didn't just use this kind of forceful approach. They could also use de-escalation and non-violent tactics, because you can't use force in every kind of conceivable situation. So in one of these scenarios, you had a Bosniak general, and he was blocking this Nordbat II supply convoys. And this is important to keep in mind, because this is also a typical tactic that was going on in this conflict, that they would block supply convoys for UN troops as a way to starve them and to make sure that they didn't have enough diesel fuel and such. So the Bosnian general, he was blocking supply convoys, and Nordbat II invited him to the camp. Say, okay, you're welcome to the camp to discuss this. First of all, they show him all the arsenal of weapons they have, including anti-tank missiles that they had brought from Sweden with thermal imaging sites. And then the cook had orders to serve this Bosniak general the worst food he could produce without being absurd. So what is the worst food you can make and still make it look real? So the cook made this terrible meal. He used like this freeze-dried kind of stuff to make like mashed potatoes, but he had lumps in it. And it was just described as a very awful kind of meal. So the general, he assumed that, of course, they're going to give me the best food they have. So this is the best food they have. So things must be really, really bad in this camp. So he was actually relented, and he ordered the convoys to be let through. So this kind of deception exercise worked. So they managed to get the supply convoys through. In another case, you had two guys in an ordinary civilian car. They were blocking the camp entrance. So they were trying to force the issue. So You could send an armored car out and just drive straight over it, but then you would kill the guys inside, and then you would cause an escalation. And in this case, one of the company commanders, he said that let's not escalate needlessly, because we can resolve this in a different way. So he sent out some people with hot coffee to the people in the car. He said, while you're waiting, here's some hot coffee, make it easier for you. And they were a bit puzzled over this. And then he waited, because he knew that they had local staff, people hired locally working inside the camp. He said, when they go home, they will have to pass through this car, if they can get past it, with their cars. And of course, when they were leaving, they got angry, said, why are you blocking the access road? We need to get home. And they were arguing and causing a stir. And finally, these two guys gave up because they couldn't argue against the local staff, and they drove off. And again, the situation was resolved. So it's not always a matter of being confrontational and aggressive. So if we switch to Dutch BAT and look at what they achieved in terms of results, we see that similar pattern here. Bosnian Serb unit controlling access to the enclave of Srebrenica. So you had Bosnian Serb units surrounding all of Srebrenica, and they were preventing the Dutch supply convoys from getting through. At one point, the Dutch were only getting 16% of their minimum supply. So the bare minimum supply levels they had calculated, they were getting 16% of that through. And they were not doing anything to actually change this, because they didn't want to upset. They had orders from their own government, actually, not to upset the Bosnian Serbs. So this, of course, resulted in long-term shortages of food and diesel. And then they would let Dutch personnel leave Srebrenica, the enclave, because they said, okay, you want to go and leave? Sure, you can go out. But then they wouldn't let them come back inside. Once they had other people returning, they said, no, you can't come in. So by doing so, they reduced the number of Dutch personnel inside Srebrenica through this kind of ruse. And these shortages, which went on for months and months, and this lack of initiative, the fact that they were constantly being played by the Bosnian Serbs and not doing anything in response, had a very negative impact on unit morale. So the morale inside Dutch BAT was getting worse and worse by the day. They were getting into fights with the local population. They were getting into fights with the ABI forces, the small units that were stationed also inside Srebrenica. They were getting in fights actually within Dutch BAT. Different companies were arguing with each other. They had senior officers, and some particularly bad examples is when you had senior Dutch officers who came to visit the enclave. And even though the Dutch BAT itself had a severe shortage of things like hot water, you had one of these generals take a very long hot shower. And the men and women of Dutch BAT, they got upset over this, and they were basically just told that, just suck it up, kind of. And this didn't exactly help unit morale either. And in some cases, you had confrontations because one of the companies, Bravo company, started to develop very strange kind of culture of its own, where they had visible Nazi paraphernalia with swastikas and things on display. They were making Nazi jokes, and this didn't go down well with the locals who heard them, and this didn't help. And at one point, someone threw a grenade not too far from Dutch BAT personnel, probably to scare them or show some protest, and things were at a very low point long before the attack itself. Then came the Vrs Attack on Srebrenica, when the Bosnian Serbs attacked the enclave. For the first few days, Dutch BAT had observation posts to have a kind of a perimeter around the outer parts of this enclave. And when these VRS units were advancing, Dutch BAT simply started to abandon these observation posts. Some units were ordered by Dutch BAT itself. So Dutch BAT command ordered some of these observation posts that you have to take a stand. You have to stick it out. You have to stay in the observation post, and you can open fire if it's necessary to do so. But then the people in the observation post simply refused, and this is documented. So you have the company commander relay orders, and the people in the observation post, they simply say, no, we're not going to do it. Too dangerous. And then at one point, after some of these Dutch troops had abandoned their observation post, And the VRS troops said, you can go. They actually volunteered to be taken hostage instead because they were afraid that something would happen to them if they started walking. So they allowed themselves to be taken hostage. Some of them were also taken hostage involuntarily. But the result of these first few days was that now the VRS has Dutch troops as hostages, which of course is very useful for them. So when the issue of air support showed up, when NATO finally was starting to be able to offer air support and planes were in the air to launch airstrikes, and the Dutch had forward air controllers who would be able to direct airstrikes against VRS as they were advancing. The Dutch battalion commander, he called up the Dutch government and said, you have to stop the airstrikes because otherwise they might kill the Dutch hostages. So the Dutch government exercised pressure to have the planes turned back as well. That wasn't the only reason the planes turned back, but you had planes that were actually in the air and they were prevented from launching airstrikes, even though everything was prepared to do that. So, and finally, the VRS assaulted Srebrenica itself, the town itself. So again, Dutch units were ordered that you have to hold positions, you have to stop the VRS, you have to do something, you have to at least force them to attack you, and they refused. I found in all of these thousands of pages of documentation, I found only one instance where a Dutch unit actually opened fire on anything, and that was, they were shooting in the air well away from the VRS troops just to see what happened, and VRS troops didn't stop, and then they pulled back. So what happened next is that, of course, the VRS enters the city, and by that time, the Dutch have absolutely no possibility to maintain any kind of control. So the Dutch troops get disarmed in some cases. The massacre happens. As you know, 5,000 people killed in this massacre. The Dutch battalion commander is humiliated when this video still exists. Last time I checked, a few years ago, it was actually on YouTube. So the Dutch commander is seen drinking a toast with Ratko Mladic, and it's just terrible, terrible all around. So I think what I argue and what I studied in my PhD dissertation is that what we see here is part of this can be understood as a difference of what I call tactical level subcultures. And that is a culture that is inside a small unit, like a battalion. So in Norbatou's case, we have a culture of being assertive, of being confrontational, but also of being friendly towards locals, trying to establish relationships with locals. Like the example I told you about having the local staff shoo away these people who were blocking the gate. But the culture of Norbatou, I also argue, is coherent. Everyone in the unit knows what everyone else is going to do in a situation, in a dangerous situation. They know what is expected of them. They know what their comrades are going to do. They are action-oriented. They are constantly seeking to achieve things. They refuse to be reduced to being passive. They are constantly trying to take the initiative, which is what they've been taught to do. And they are pragmatic in the sense that, okay, so we have these rules of engagement, but if they get in the way of getting to the mission objective, we'll simply ignore the rules. So at one point they had the rules of engagement said that you have to fire warning shots. And then the battalion commander said to the parties, he said to, I think, the Bosnian Serbs, he said, oh, I'm sorry, we're out of warning shots. Next time we shoot to kill from the start, because we have no more warning shots. So Dutchbat, in contrast, was cautious, very quickly or immediately took this cautious approach. They became timid rather than confrontational. Unfortunately, they also started to develop hostility towards the locals they were supposed to protect. And this is also well documented. The whole unit started to become fragmented. Bravo company was doing its own strange thing. The other companies were arguing between each other, and they had lots of conflicts. They became passive. So the Bosnian Serbs were constantly giving them new dictates, constantly manipulating and moving them, and they were constantly just responding to this. And they were dogmatic in terms of both rules of engagement and orders from their government. So they were doing exactly as they thought they were supposed to be doing, regardless, not thinking about the mission, but thinking about the rules, first of all. So the outcomes, as we've looked at, are are as follows. So Norbat 2 became known as Shoot Bat, was kind of the nickname. They prevented and acted against atrocities in Bakovici, which was the hospital, Stupnido, which was the massacre and the refugee situation, and several other well-documented examples. They enforced freedom of movement. They made sure that the parties to the conflict were not able to stop them from moving around, to stop them from investigating. And as a result, they achieved publicity in the form of good press. The Swedish media and Danish media, Scandinavian media, was very positive, had a major presence in Bosnia throughout this mission and reported back home. And people back home thought that basically our guys are doing the good work here. So decorations for bravery were awarded in several cases here, for example, after the hospital siege. And it was good PR for the armed forces, really increased the standing of the armed forces from a societal perspective. And the reputation of the government was strengthened as well, even though the government actually tried to make them more cautious, but they refused. Norbat 2 refused. They did things their own way. But since people weren't aware of what the government was trying to do, but just seeing what Norbat 2 was actually doing, it reflected positively back on the government. So the government just basically tried to make it look as if it was their plan all along. Ditchbat is what Dutchbat became known as because they were driving, they had difficulty driving trucks in difficult road conditions. They failed to intervene in Srebrenica. They had no freedom of movement, basically at any point during the mission. And they also had a lot of publicity, especially, as you know, after the massacre in '95, which was very bad press. The entire Dutch armed forces had to endure a lot of criticism, and the government, several years later, when the report was published in 2002, the entire Dutch government had to resign because the report that was commissioned by the government put a lot of blame on the Dutch government throughout the entire, both in terms of preparation, in terms of what the mission was, in terms of equipment, in terms of orders. The blame was very clearly, to a large extent, to be attributed to the Dutch government. So Norbat 2, I argue, is seen from a mission perspective here a success, and Dutchbat was a failure. So why these different outcomes? Same theater, same time period, 93 to 95. Same mandate, same rules of engagement. Same sector command even. They were both under Sector Northeast, which was based in Tuzla. So they had exact same command hierarchy above them. And this is, again, where I argue that the tactical level subcultures come into play. So a coherent tactical level subculture, I would say, is a kind of force multiplier. It makes the unit much more capable than you would expect. It makes it better at handling any kind of situation, basically. Because you can have different subcultures, but the important thing is that they are coherent. Because if you have a fragmented subculture like this one that doesn't have a focal point, then you don't know what the different parts of the unit are going to do when they're faced with difficult situations and they have to operate independently. And this is what happened in Srebrenica. When you have different companies doing different things, not communicating, not knowing what to expect others to do, and then they start to become passive and cautious and fall back on whatever they think is the safest route. So the focal point in the case of Norbat 2, I would say the most important focal point is the 1st battalion commander and the battalion commander that followed after him. They really set the tone. And after that, you have established a firm, well-functioning tactical level subculture. So other important factors here, the personnel from Norbat 2 were recruited specifically for going to Bosnia. That was the entire extent of what they were supposed to do. So officers volunteered for it, and former conscripts volunteered to go to Bosnia. And they knew that we are going to Bosnia, and once the mission is over, we go back to civilian life, or in the case of the officers, we go back to our regular jobs. So they were motivated to go to Bosnia, because that's what they were supposed to do. Dutchbat, on the other hand, had career professionals who did not specifically expect to go to Bosnia. They had not signed up for that. They belonged to an elite unit, which was called the Air Mobile Brigade. They were probably expecting to do completely different things. We have what I call functional imperatives, which means basically what kind of equipment do you have and what kind of possibilities and limitations does that mean. Norbat 2 was heavily armed, which gave them a lot of freedom of movement, gave them freedom options. Because if you have heavy armament, you know that you cannot be pushed around, at least not without being able to push back. Whereas Dutch Bat was lightly armed from the start, which limited their ability to do anything even before they arrived in country. Other formative factors is that Norbat II was the result of having a strong tradition in the Swedish Armed Forces of mission command, of where you put the mission first. The mission objectives come first, everything else comes second. If there are rules that will prevent you from achieving the mission objective, you disregard the rules. If you have orders that will prevent you from achieving the mission objective, you disobey orders. That's perfectly fine. You must at all points try to achieve the mission. There is nothing more important than achieving the mission. Nothing. Never. And the most egregious sin of all is to not act. To be passive is unforgivable. You will get thrown out for that. If you do something wrong, that's fine. You can correct it afterwards. But being passive is unforgivable. You can never be passive. It's never accepted. That's the kind of tradition that was existing. And the focal points here, in the case of Norbat, as I said, you had focal points. You had battalion commanders who helped gather all of this up and create coherent units and guide their subordinates by always being examples. They were always at the front. They were always talking to their subordinates. They're talking to the enlisted men, talking to the officers, talking to everyone, always present, always working. Whereas in the case of Dutch Bat, the two last Dutch battalion commanders were mostly absent, not really staying informed, not on a personal level, not talking to their people. They were shutting themselves away, basically, talking to their government instead. So this is what I argue is the difference. You get a dissonance in the case of Dutch Bat because you don't have a focal point. And that is one of the reasons you get fragmentation. And that's why Dutch Bat started to fall apart. So in conclusion, Norbat II was a good fit for this situation and for these mission objectives. But it's also important to note that Norbat II was not a perfect unit, because you can't have a perfect unit. It just so happens that in Bosnia, during these years, during this conflict, that's what I would say was needed. It wasn't perfect because it couldn't do everything they were supposed to do, but under the circumstances, that was probably the best anyone could achieve. And autonomy, which Norbat actually took more than they had, provides flexibility to cope with situations like this. The Dutch were micromanaging. The government tried to micromanage Dutch Bat throughout the entire mission. They wanted to be informed of everything, approve of everything, control everything. The Swedish government was not able to do that because the battalion commander said, no, you're not going to control me because I'm here, I know what needs to get done. And if they started to try to control him, he would simply switch off the radio. He would say, the radio is not working. It won't be working for a few hours. And then he did whatever he had to do, and a few hours later, he would call them back up and say, I've done this now, so it's done. But also, if you have tactical level subcultures like this, they have to be compatible with the strategic objectives to make full use of autonomy. Because if you have different strategic objectives, maybe that require a higher degree of control, then this wouldn't work very well. This unit would be difficult to use. Also, finally, that tactical level subcultures have to be maintained. It's not something you can create and then just leave it and think that, okay, I've done this work. It has to be constantly maintained. So that was, in Norbat II's case, you had these battalion commanders, they were on location, they were always present, always acting, always being role models. And that helped keep the unit together. Whereas in the case of the Dutch, whatever culture they had when they deployed was destroyed by going to Bosnia and replaced by something else that didn't work. And you can see that the unit was, it was in shambles when they got back to the Netherlands. That's all I have. Thank you.